So how did the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, come together? At one level, that's simple. God wrote the Bible. It's his word to us. And that's true. But what about from the human point of view? What people and processes did God use to get his law to us? Most people assume that the answer to this question is simple. Someone, let's say Moses, sat down one day and wrote the whole thing, start to finish. But when you look closely at the text, there are some clues that things may not be as simple as that. Sure, we know that Moses wrote bits of the Pentateuch because the text tells us so. So Moses wrote down this law, Deuteronomy 31. But it never says who put the whole Pentateuch together. And to be honest, there are some bits of the Pentateuch that would be weird if Moses did write them. Like Numbers 12. Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Or Deuteronomy 34. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab. And then there are some clues that whoever did produce the first draft of the Pentateuch wasn't starting from scratch either. For instance, Numbers 21:14 includes a quotation from an earlier source that it refers to as the Book of the Wars of Yahweh. So, what was this book? Well, nobody knows, except for the 4 lines copied in Numbers. Now, here are the obvious clues, but there's some more subtle clues too. Take the creation account in Genesis. There's actually 2 creation accounts there, telling the story in slightly different ways. Chapter 1 tells the story of creation in 6 days, but then in chapter 2, verse 4, we rewind and tell the whole story again, except this time the focus is on humanity, and the style is less poetic, and the order that things are made in is actually slightly different. Humans are made before plants, whereas in chapter 1, humans were made last of all. And interestingly, in these 2 different accounts, the name used for God is different. In chapter 1, he's called Elohim, the generic Hebrew word for God. But in chapter 2, he's called Yahweh. That's the God of Israel's special covenant name. So, on the human side of the equation, it seems very much like the Pentateuch, in the form that we have it today, is more of a group work assignment than the work of a single author. Now, people have been noticing these features for a while, but from about the 19th century onwards, there's been a very influential fad, shall we say, within biblical studies, which is all about reconstructing how that group work assignment came together, who worked on which part of the assignment and when. This approach to the Bible is called the documentary hypothesis, and the big name to remember is a German guy called Julius Wellhausen. There are 2 elements of the hypothesis: the sources and the dating. First, the sources. The documentary hypothesis really gets the scissors out and cuts the Pentateuch up into 4 main sources. Now, this is all an educated guess. No one really knows who these members of the group work team really were, so they give them code names: J, E, D, and P. Remember those clues that Genesis 1 and 2 were originally separate creation accounts? One of them uses Yahweh as the name of God, so this author is called the Yahwist, and it gets the letter J from the German spelling of Yahweh. The other source uses Elohim, and so this one gets called the Elohist, or the letter E for short. That's J and E. Well, whoever wrote Deuteronomy gets called the Deuteronomist, letter D. And finally, all the bits of the Pentateuch that are about sacrifices and rituals and lists and genealogies and politics between the different groups of priests, well, they figure that that stuff's only going to be interesting to priests because it's boring, and priests are boring people. So that's called the priestly source, P. So we have 4 members of the group work assignment: J, D, E, and P. We then can grab our scissors and go through the Pentateuch, cutting out all the bits into those 4 sources. And we do that using 2 main rules: the same name rule and the no double dipping rule. They're my names for it. They have proper names too. The same name rule is where we assume that each source consistently uses the same name for God. So does a narrative use the name Yahweh for God? Well, it's probably J. Does it use Elohim? Maybe it's E. The other rule is the no double dipping rule. Is a story repeated in two different places? Well, we assume that sources never repeat themselves, so similar content must come from different sources. And so with those two rules, you can go through the Pentateuch and divide it up into JEDP. Once we've gone through the Pentateuch, we can even keep going using the same rules and divide up the rest of the Old Testament. So that's the sources. The second element of the documentary hypothesis, though, is the dating. And here's where it gets really interesting. We have these 4 different sources behind the Pentateuch, but they didn't all come together at the same time. So what order were they written in? Well, Wellhausen has a theory about how Israel's religion developed. In the early days, it was pretty free-flowing, sacrifice wherever you want, however you like. But in the later period, it became much more structured and bureaucratic. You can only worship in Jerusalem, and there are strict rules for priests and so on. He also had a theory about 2 Kings chapter 22. That's the bit where it says King Josiah discovers the law shortly before the exile. Well, his theory is that that's actually Deuteronomy, or at least a version of Deuteronomy. So if Deuteronomy, D in the JEDP, dates to the 7th century BC during Josiah's reforms, then that's our fixed point, and so we can work backwards from that. J and E are much less bureaucratic, and so on his theory, they must be older. So let's date them back to the 10th century and the 8th century, respectively. P, however, is highly structured rules for worship, so let's make that later than D, say the 5th century after the exile, when people are starting to try to reassert some things into order. According to the documentary hypothesis, these texts weren't all combined together at once, but they came together in different stages. First, J and E sometime in the 8th century, then J and E and D a bit after Josiah, and then JEDP in the 5th century. Some scholars got on board with this theory originally thinking that, well, the books themselves might be late, but they're preserving much earlier oral traditions, perhaps even going back to Moses. More suspicious scholars, however, thought that each text was a complete work of fiction from the time, so maybe they didn't so much discover Deuteronomy in Josiah's day as make it up to serve some political need. Well, Wellhausen wasn't the first to look at all these issues in this way, but he did make them widely accepted. In fact, this documentary hypothesis is pretty much the accepted model for the growth of the Pentateuch until about the 1970s. But since then, the consensus around it has started breaking down. On the sources issue, people have started having second thoughts about those principles for getting the scissors out and dividing it up. So, does the fact that a narrative repeat mean that it must have been hastily copied from 2 sources? Or is repetition actually a very common literary technique? In which case, by getting our scissors to the text, we're actually ruining a perfectly good artwork. A lot of people, myself included, feel that the scissors fad has gone on a little bit too far. While there may be merit to it, what we really should be doing is trying to understand not the sources behind the text we have, but trying to understand the text we have as literature. And then on the dating front, opinions now vary wildly about when to date all the elements. Remember, it was all based on Wellhausen's theory about how Israelite religion evolved from less bureaucratic to more bureaucratic over time. But if you change the theory, the dates all change. And about the dating issue, people have been asking some good questions to challenge the consensus. Why can't there have been a developed system for priests early on in Israel's history? Other nations had complicated bureaucracies. Why not Israel? And how come Ezekiel, say, writing before the exile, seems very much to be quoting from the Pentateuch, which the documentary hypothesis says he can't be because that's post-exile? And if Deuteronomy is meant to be all about Josiah's centralization of worship in Jerusalem, why doesn't it mention Jerusalem? In fact, why does it tell them to sacrifice in a slightly different place? And finally, isn't the simplest explanation for why Genesis reflects ancient customs that it accurately preserves traditions handed down from those ancient times? At the same time, I should say more radical scholars have gone fully the other way, saying that everything dates from much, much later than originally thought. In fact, some radical scholars would date the Pentateuch around 300 BC. And in this view, all those literary allusions back to the Pentateuch in the later parts of the Old Testament, actually the allusions go the other way. The Exodus, on this view, from Egypt was made up after Isaiah's description of an Exodus from exile in Babylon. Now, what do we do with this? Well, it all comes down to your attitude towards the Bible. If you're inclined to be suspicious of the text, then you can interpret all the evidence to support your theory that the Bible is a late forgery made up by people who only ever serve their own interests. But if you've got a more open attitude towards the text, then I really don't think there's any reason to doubt that God has, in his providence, used human tradition passed down through generations to reveal his faithfulness through a long-standing relationship with Abraham and his descendants.